Thomas Sowell, The Housing Boom and Bust, Revised Edition. Welcome to the riveting summary of The Housing Boom and Bust, Revised Edition, by Thomas Sowell. This powerful exploration dives deep into the myriad factors and players involved in the housing bubble and the subsequent economic crisis. Get ready to uncover the complex role of key institutions like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Federal Reserve, and HUD, as well as the impact of government policies on housing prices and affordability. Learn how land use restrictions, creative financing, and political beliefs transformed homeownership in the United States and contributed to the housing boom and bust.
The housing bubble burst. The housing bubble was the result of a group of actors, including Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Federal Reserve, Wall Street investment houses, and affordable housing advocates, pursuing their own goals without coordination. This lack of direction led to the housing boom, bust, and the economic crisis that followed. The real cause of the housing bubble. Equity in a home is the biggest investment for most American homeowners, accounting for 42% of their total net worth. Housing is also a significant expense for renters. However, high interest rates and down payments have always been major obstacles to homeownership. In the early 2000s, financial institutions developed risky new instruments that allowed low or no down payments. As a result, more people entered the housing market, and housing prices soared to record highs. Unfortunately, local factors drove the boom and eventually burst the housing bubble. The housing price rises that preceded the housing market collapse were heavily concentrated in a few regions, particularly California. The explanation for this sudden jump in housing prices resides in land use policies. The laws that California implemented in the 1970s restricting the use of land had the effect of diminishing the amount of available, buildable land. Therefore, rising demand met a shrinking supply of land in the early 2000s. Cities such as Houston that lacked zoning laws did not endure skyrocketing housing prices like California. Moreover, governmental intervention consistently has resulted in less housing that is affordable, as seen in other developed markets like Great Britain. Curiously, affordable housing advocates prefer to use laws and policies to force the government to subsidize more low-priced housing or to compel the private sector to charge less. However, these advocates rarely attack land use restrictions, which are the real cause of unaffordable housing. In conclusion, the housing bubble was not evenly spread across the U.S. but concentrated in a few regions where government policy, especially land use restrictions, narrowed the supply of land for building homes. The affordable housing crisis can be fixed, but not by forcing the government to subsidize more low-priced housing or by mandating the private sector to charge less. Instead, advocating for the elimination of land use restrictions can lead to an affordable housing market. The government's role in the housing crisis. The government's aggressive intervention in the housing market led to the 2008 financial crisis. Both major U.S. political parties believed that promoting home ownership was crucial, and thus policies were implemented to make homes affordable to lower-income people. However, this government pressure on banks and lenders to loosen mortgage standards had a dangerous impact. Non-traditional and subprime mortgages were given to unqualified borrowers who ultimately defaulted on their loans. The mortgage funding institutions, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were unable to sustain the high volume of risky loans, leading to a financial collapse. Despite warnings from economists, political leaders refused to acknowledge the systemic risk and continued to defend the aggressive government policies. The belief in biased lending policies made a significant political impact, but the devastating economic consequences could not be ignored. The housing bubble. In the early 2000s, financial engineers created mortgage products that allowed more people to enter the housing market. Adjustable-rate mortgages, interest-only mortgages, and home equity loans allowed borrowers to own equity before even making a payment towards the principal. These financial engineering tools encouraged people to buy homes and flip them with the rising market. Subprime loans became popular, especially among minority populations with no previous home buying experience. Investors felt secure with favorable ratings from Moody's and Standard & Poor's. The housing bubble burst when borrowers and lenders acted irresponsibly, and the government and financial markets also contributed to the disaster. Understanding the 2008 housing crisis. The article explains how high interest rates, creative financing, and mortgage defaults led to the housing bust of 2008, causing a decline in property prices and foreclosures in California, Nevada, Arizona, and Florida. The article further states that mortgages were parts of complex securities held by investors worldwide, and defaults lowered their value, wiping out prestigious financial institutions. The housing market witnessed a significant decline in 2006 after the Federal Reserve raised interest rates in 2004, a cue that mortgage rates followed, which led to a fall in housing prices. This decline was more pronounced in areas with higher creative financing usage. The article points out that subprime borrowers who could no longer make their mortgage payments, or strategic defaulters who could afford to pay but chose not to, ultimately defaulted. Defaults had a severe impact on Wall Street as mortgages were involved in complex securities held by investors worldwide. Defaults sent the value of these securities spiraling downwards, threatening well-respected financial institutions, such as Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, and Citibank. California, Nevada, Arizona, and Florida experienced a pattern of absentee ownership, which was presumably a sign of speculation. Half of the sales of existing homes in the San Francisco Bay Area in December 2008 belonged to foreclosed properties that were marketed by banks at rock-bottom prices. On the other hand, areas like Dallas that had only 13% of average income spent on housing experienced only a small drop of 3% in housing prices. Existing property homeowners who did not have subprime loans became skeptical about paying off mortgages that exceeded the value of their properties in the collapsed market. Deciding it made more sense economically, many defaulted, leaving the banks with the property. The article concludes by stating that the housing crisis had done a lot of damage to the American economy, primarily because of the fallout on Wall Street. It further suggests that it was remarkable how the American economy, in general, had made significant improvements over the years, except for a few that turned out bad within a short time. The New Deal misconception. The New Deal policies did not end the Great Depression, and emulating them during present crises is risky. Following the Great Depression, some experts suggested following the example of the New Deal policies to bring America back to prosperity. However, this overlooks the unintended consequences of government intervention and unclear outcomes that created uncertainty and prevented people from spending their money. The economic landscape suffered immensely as new institutions were established, while business investment was discouraged, delaying economic recovery. It was not the New Deal policies that ended the Great Depression but the entry of the United States into World War II, which provided an action plan, removed uncertainty, and allowed business to work through cost-plus contracts that created the required materials for the prosecution of the war effort. It would be unwise for America to adopt the New Deal policies during the present crises. Insufficiently thought-out policies and risky economic intervention can have disastrous consequences, as exemplified by the anguish set off by the housing market boom and bust. Thus, Americans should learn from this and be reluctant to expand government intervention in the economy.
In conclusion, The Housing Boom and Bust, Revised Edition, offers a profound understanding of the key factors and players that contributed to the U.S. housing bubble, its burst, and the resulting global economic crisis. Thomas Sowell shows how land use restrictions, creative financing, and political intervention all played a role in the market's downfall. Crucial takeaways include recognizing the importance of affordable housing, questioning the involvement of government policies in the housing market, and understanding the unintended consequences of their intervention. Overall, this book serves as a valuable lesson and warning about the complexity of the housing market and our need to approach it with utmost caution and vigilance.